Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our research seminar. And let me present our today's speaker. It's Vasily Rusanov. Vasily, the floor is yours.
Okay, hi, I'm very glad to be here. So I'm going to talk about the Russian All Believers. And this is actually, this work is my master thesis that I wrote at the New Economics School. These are my advisors, to whom I'm very grateful for their guidance. So this is a research in progress. I really hope to make something of it, and I would be very glad to hear your comments in the end. I really want to have some feedback, because right now I don't exactly know where I should be moving. Here's my plan. First, I'm going to talk about the motivation, the reasons I want to study the All Believers, and I'm going to talk about minorities and social capital. Then I'll give you some background on the All Believers. Just as a disclaimer, I'm not a historian, so maybe I don't know all the historical details, and some of the questions that you may have about the history of the All Believers, I might refer you to the historical literature. Then I'm going to talk about the relevant economic literature. Namely, I'm going to talk about the Protestants and the research on them. Then I'm going to make a claim, and I'm going to tell you my identification strategy. Then I'm going to give you the results, and then I will conclude. So essentially my work attempts to show that it was the social capital that made the Russian All Believers so successful. The definition that I'm following is that social capital is the connections among the individuals, social norms of reciprocity and trustworthiness that arise from them. So it's a rising topic. There are many empirical papers, cross-country, regional, or individual level, but most of them rely on something different from what I'm trying to do. So there is also a lot of research on the role of close-knit minorities in different countries. So we see research on the Jews in Europe, the Chinese in Malaysia, the Armenians in Turkey. And we know that minorities tend to form intra-group ties and increase trust, which benefits their business. However, to my knowledge, there is no study that attempts to use, to show that it is, to empirically test the idea that probably it is the social capital of the minorities that makes them so successful. So why is it an interesting question? It's an interesting question because they share the environment with the general population. Whenever we make a cross-sectional study of different countries, like we attempt to compare the south of Italy that has low trust to the north of Italy that has high trust, there are also some omitted variables that that create a concern. Maybe it's geography, maybe it's some historical past, so it's difficult because the different regions can be different. Minorities, on the other hand, they are usually in the same place as the majority, so we can actually try to find something because of this. So I'm trying to use minorities for an empirical study of social capital. Now, some background on the All Believers. So this is the famous Morozov dynasty, which was basically the original idea why I wanted to study this. These are the two most famous, I think, one of the most famous hospitals in Moscow built on the money of the All Believers. So the All Believers have a reputation for being very wealthy. This is something that probably many of you heard about. The merchants, the Morozovs, the Rябushinsky, all of these people were known to be very, very rich. So the All Believers, it's a religious minority that exists since 1667, after there was a religious reform changing the ceremonial side of Russian Orthodoxy. So in 1667, the Russian official church decided that the ceremonies should be standard. Before 17th century, people used to baptize themselves with 2 fingers or with 3 fingers. The church decided that people should baptize themselves with only 3. There were other ideas like how the ceremonials should be done clockwise or counterclockwise, so there was a standard imposed, and all of these concerned the ceremonies. And there was a part of the population who decided not to follow these rules, and they were selected into the old belief in the early 18th century. Originally they were basically killed for their disagreement, and Tsar Alexei in the late 17th century killed many old believers. Peter the Great stopped the killings, but he imposed a very high tax on people who did not want to adhere to the official church. There was a long history of persecution, but basically to this or that extent, the old believers were persecuted for until 1905. So there was various degree of government and official church oppression until this time. In 1897, the old believers made up about 4.1% of the population of the Moscow province. This is higher than Russia's average, but what is good for my research is that the variation was actually quite large within the region. So in some places you had 0, in some places you had 80%. I'll show you the maps later. So what research exists on the old believers? So right now we know, Kufenko and Raskov did this. They show that the old believers were overrepresented among owners of Russian textile factories. Textiles were the driver of the economic growth in Russia in 19th century. The old believers seem to control many more factories than the 4% that they would have controlled if the representation was proportional. Also there is some historical evidence that the old believers successfully formed business networks, often between different denominations and communes. So old believers actually is not a single Old belief is not a single religion. Actually, there are many denominations, so they started to split very early. Those who agreed to have priests, those who didn't want to have priests, because you can't have priests without a patriarch, and the new patriarch is not a true patriarch. Then there were two types that agreed to pray for Tsar and who didn't agree to pray for Tsar. Then there were two more types who wanted to put money in finance and those who didn't want to put money in finance. So that's already 2 times 2 times 2 gives you 8. And many splits within these 8. So there were many denominations. They were different, but it seems like often between different denominations and communes, the networks were formed. So they helped each other even though they disagreed on some religious parts. Okay. Probably I should. Yeah, I'll skip the first two. So, what my claim is that social networks were the important part, but shortly after Weber published his Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, they were compared to Protestants for their ethics. So they were also known to be they had an image of being hardworking, sober. So people believed that old believers drink less, and probably the ethic was different for the old believers. And also they tended to have higher literacy rates for a very simple reason. The same reason Protestants had higher literacy rates. Many old believers didn't have priests, which means they had to read and interpret Bible themselves. What does it mean? It means that you have to learn how to read. So the literacy rates were higher, which gives you a human capital story. And why else are old believers interesting as a minority? They didn't seem to face any hatred from the Orthodox people. So they were facing oppression from the side of the government, but you can't imagine anything like the Crystal Knight for the old believers. They were never hated by the general Orthodox population. It was more like the Orthodox population was feeling for them, and there was some, if not support, probably it was at least sympathy. So we probably can disentangle potentially the conflict and the oppression here. Okay, so I'm going to summarize. There is little economic research on the old believers. There is a lot of research on the Protestants. The old believers are actually very different from the Protestants. So I would be glad to motivate my research by saying that the old believers are the Russian Protestants. Unfortunately, you can't do this. For example, because the Protestantism was formed as a reformatist movement, while the Old Believers were inherently conservative. They wanted to go back to the origins of the orthodoxy. So this is why they're different. I guess everybody heard about the Weber's hypothesis that the Protestant ethic, entrepreneurship, work in secular world, thriftiness, was an important force behind the modern capitalism. Now, there was some research on this in the recent years. Beggar and Woosman said that it seems like it actually went through the human capital. So they tried to tell a different story, not about the ethics, but about the human capital. They showed that in 1870s Prussia, literacy rates were higher among the Protestants. And also the Protestants had more schools. For the reason I already told you about, they needed to read the Bible and believed that education is important. Luther said that you have to teach your children to read. And they used distance to Wittenberg as an instrument for the share of Protestants in different regions of Prussia in 1870s. Then Hornung in 2014 showed that in 17th century many French Protestants were forced to leave France, and there seemed to be technology spillovers from more advanced Huguenot immigrants to less educated Prussian population. So many Prussian Protestants were not originally Prussian, many of them came from France, and Hornung showed that those immigrants, it seemed like they gave some technology knowledge to the Prussian population, and he showed that again in the textile industry there were benefits in terms of productivity in places where the Huguenots came. And he instrumented the Huguenots' immigration with the plague losses of Prussian cities, because they were not connected with the textile productivity, but they were connected with how many Huguenots came to Prussia. Finally, Cantoni showed that Protestantism actually doesn't seem to have any effect. He discussed the different lands in the German territory of the Holy Roman Empire, and it seems like the Protestant cities didn't grow faster. So his claim is that there is no impact, and actually the Protestantism does not affect economic growth at all. And he also instruments the distance to the number of Protestants with the distance to Wittenberg. So this is what we have on Protestants. Now, what am I going to do? So my claim is that the Old Believers had high productivity in the textile industry, which explained their wealth and overrepresentation among the factory owners. This is the first claim, and the second claim is that this is driven by their social capital. Now, what am I doing here? I have the data on 272 textile factories in Moscow province. Unfortunately, the city of Moscow is excluded. Many factories were located within Moscow. I don't have any information on the factories within the city boundaries. And this is the population, it's not a sample. These are all the factories that existed in 1882. For each factory, I have the address with coordinates. I have the number of workers, wages. I have many proxies for capital. So I have machinery, total horsepowers of the machinery, cost of materials. I know whether the factory is incorporated or not. There is a lot of research, in particular Yale seems to be interested in this, on the importance of incorporation for the productivity in Russia in 19th century. If you became a corporation, it was easier to attract finance, so you became more productive. I know the share of Old Believers within a 7-kilometer radius from 1897 census. So unfortunately, there is a 15-year gap between the census and the time I have the information on the factories. I hope that it didn't change much. And I have a variety of statistics on the peasants on the township level. Population, literacy, agriculture, number of mills, many indicators. So to understand what I'm doing, you should understand this map. I have here two things. First, I have the factories that are shown with red triangles. Okay, so each triangle is a factory. This is the Moscow province. Okay, it's smaller than the modern Moscow region. So some territories here are now in Moscow region, and also, I guess, some territories here. But it's quite a big thing. This is 100 kilometers, so this is about 200. And I have the triangles for the factories, and I have the localities. So most of them are simply villages. The size of the triangle represents the number of workers in a factory. The size of the circle represents the population, but unfortunately I didn't manage to make it very representative. Anyway, the circles are different. Yes?
Just a clarification question. Were the borders of Moscow were located at that time? I mean,
very
modern city, how it looks like?
Something like Sadovое кольцо. Okay, approximately. Yeah,
and
that's a good approximation.
Moscow region?
Sometimes the border coincides. For example, here the border is the same, and here. Here we had some new territories acquired, I heard, but the old border, I guess it's a little farther, and there is a big chunk over here. Yeah. So, yeah. By the way, feel free to ask your questions as I'm moving. I don't know whether I'm too fast or too slow. So the circles represent the villages, and the color of the circle represents the number of the old believers living in it. The white circles have 0% of old believers. The dark blue circles have from 80 to 100% of old believers. As you can see, the old believers were heavily concentrated here. Some of them were here, but occasionally you have different places with the old believers all over the map. So yeah, this is what I have. So for each factory, I can calculate within 7-kilometer radius the share of the old believers in the population. Yeah, these are all the localities in the Moscow region that have more than 500 people, and all the textile factories. So what am I doing? I'm estimating a Cobb-Douglas production function, first using simple OLS and then using instrumental variables. So a unit of observation is a factory, and for each factory I regress the total revenue on the constant, the share of old believers, logarithm of it, the number of workers, and some proxy for the capital. Okay, what instruments am I using? This is probably the important part. First, I use an instrument for the share of all believers. And I instrument the share of all believers with a distance to their cemeteries in Moscow and a region in Guslitse, formed in late 1771. Let's have a look at this. On the east of Moscow, you have two cemeteries of the old believers, Preobrazhenskaya and Rogozhskaya. They still exist, you have old believers there. And they were formed after Moscow was hit by plague in 1771. Many people died, and Catherine the Great decided to allow the old believers to settle there to make up for the population that died. So the old believers were allowed for the first time to live in Moscow. This is when these centers are formed. For this center, the history seems to be more obscure. I didn't find any documents about this, but this is where they decided to hide in the early 18th century when they were persecuted by the government. These were basically territories that were far from Moscow. And I hope that this is what I'm trying to claim, is that this is exogenous to anything that has to anything about the textiles, because the textile industry didn't exist at that time. These are the two centers, and I instrument the share of all believers in each factory with a distance to these 2 points on a map. And I also instrument labor and capital, and I use for this the seed ratios. It's a measure of the crop yields. So for each factory, I know near the factory what was the land productivity, how productive the land was. So I can instrument the number of workers working on the factory with the measure of the crop yields. I hope that if the land is more productive, then people decide not to go to a factory. They decide to stay and work in agriculture. If it was not productive, then they move to a factory. And I also have the cattle and horses per capita. Same story here. If the agriculture was developed, people didn't go to a factory. If it was developed, they didn't. Yeah, this reflects the working choices. All right. Now, what are my results? The most important row here is the log share of all believers near the factory. Okay, and so first, when I regress the total revenue, I have the expected coefficients here. By the way, the constant returns to scale hypothesis is not rejected. So these two are equal to 1, the sum of them. As you can see, the share of all believers positively affects the total revenue, controlling for these two. So the more all believers lived near a factory, the more productive it was. The number of textile factories within 10 kilometers also seemed to matter, so I control for the clustering effects too, but we still have a positive coefficient here. This unfortunately vanishes when I control for the longitude of factory. People who do this sort of geography stuff know that you have to control for longitude, for example, if you're studying Turkey. But my claim is that I think that this is simply multicollinearity. I don't know anything about the reasons why the east of Moscow is more developed, whether east of Moscow is better for the textiles than the west of Moscow, and I think that its longitude predicts the share of all believers quite well. So the problem is that we can't really disentangle the two given the number of observations. Then I instrument the labor and the capital. The coefficient is still there. It's still significant. I instrument the share of all believers. I instrument both. I still get something around 8%. And the important result that I have is that even if you control for the literacy rates in the township, which is administrative level, the lowest administrative level near the factory, the coefficient is still positive and statistically significant at 10%, meaning that even if you control for the literacy rates, the human capital, you still have the positive effect of the all believers on the productivity of the factory. So I think that this refutes the human capital story of the all believers prominence. I also control for the number of pubs and drinking houses in the township, which is a proxy for how much people drink. I don't find that it has any effect on the, it's actually negative but not significant. It doesn't have any effect on the productivity of factories, and the coefficient on the all believers is still there. So this is the first thing that I have. The second thing that I have is why am I claiming that this is social capital? I'm claiming this because this is another thing that I'm doing here. I'm introducing the interactions between the dummy for an OB district and the log share of all believers. Look at the map. It's probably, unfortunately, I don't have a map which shows this clearly, but Moscow region was divided into 10 big districts. So these are quite large territories. There were 10 of them in the province. And this province here had many all believers, while these have very few. What am I doing? I'm interacting the share of all believers with the dummy for an OB district. And when I include this in my regression, I see that the coefficient is positive, but the share of all believers near the factory itself is not important. What does it mean? It means that if the factory had many all believers near it, it only mattered if there were many all believers in the big district where the factory was located. So you only benefit from being an all believers factory if there are many all believers in the district. Okay? Yeah, and this is the evidence that I have for the social capital. So my conclusion is that the all believers had higher total factory productivity than the general population, and the effect is statistically and economically significant. The magnitude is quite large, actually, because all of this is in logarithms. And this explains the role in the textile industry in 19th century Russia that the historians have documented. The likely effect goes through the social capital. It only persists in the districts with a high share of the all believers. So this is what I have. I'm now planning to expand the sample because I also have the data. No, I don't have it, but the data on the 1897 also exists somewhere in the books, and it has to be digitized. So I plan to expand the sample, and I maybe will create a panel, but probably it will simply be pooled data because matching factories is a difficult thing since the owners could change. Maybe I can do it using geography. I'm also thinking about including population statistics from the neighboring provinces. So many factories are on the border, as you can see. So you have many factories right near the border. And unfortunately, I don't know what's going on here. I didn't code the data for all these provinces here, even though the data exists. And finally, I'm planning. I see that the effect. Yeah, sorry. I see that the effect goes through the social ties, but I need to have more evidence of this. So I'm thinking about discussing something related to the communes. So, like I said, there were two cemeteries in Moscow, and there still are two All Believers cemeteries in Moscow, and these acted as the communes where you could receive some support. The mechanism that the historians documented really well was finance. So the All Believers believed that the loans, it is not right to collect interest on the loans. So on many occasions you could get a free, interest-free loan from the commune. Of course, how interest-free it actually was, we don't know, because maybe you didn't have to return some money, but you didn't have to return something else. So it was simply informal mechanism, and it wasn't that free actually. I didn't find much evidence for things like, how to say, when they form the supply chains, some exchange of information probably. I'm still looking through what the historians wrote on this, but unfortunately I didn't find any text which says, look, the All Believers told each other how the supply chains should be formed, they exchanged this information here and here. I don't have it. I'm thinking about what kind of data could help me show directly that social capital was the mechanism. So I need the historian's support, but I also need some data. There exists a data set which is called the Russian corporations data set. What is interesting about Russian history is that all the corporations of the Russian Empire until 1917 were, if you wanted to be incorporated, Tsar himself had to sign the charter. So all the corporations went through Tsar, and the documents about these incorporations are there. And there is a data set that tells you who were the founders of the corporation and some like the capital and some other things like the location and the specialization. Maybe I could use this, but unfortunately identifying whether a person is an All Believer or not is very difficult. All right, so this is it. This is everything I had to say. I'd be very glad to hear some comments or some questions. Thank you.
Yes, please.
So, on one hand, you consider the share of, well, you were trying to say that social capital was important, but your mechanism through loans, it may help business to develop, and it may not be important as a measure of quality of the workers.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you could disentangle this to the economic development of the small region and the quality of the labor, because it seems like the All Believers were more of a business elite, not just the workers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about this. So frankly, I have a proxy for the All Believers status of a factory. The proxy is geographic. But as a matter of fact, I think that this is both the owner and the workers. So I were thinking about the social ties between the managers, well, since the owner is often a manager, and the workers. These are the social ties that I'm also thinking about. But the problem is, so there is data on, what did Rusanov do, a historian? He attributed the factories only in Moscow to, so he basically went to the cemeteries, he looked at the tombs, and he tried to compare the tombs, the names of the tombs, with the list of the merchants in Moscow. And this is how he attributed the owners of factories to the old believers. It doesn't seem to be possible with the whole region, but ideally, yeah, this is what I wanted to do.
Well, in studies such as yours, people usually have problems to support their historical evidence and intuition by econometrics. And in your case, it's the other way around. You have fairly solid econometric evidence, and I think what you still lack is some historical data, some anecdotal evidence that social capital matter. One thing is you prove the significance of social capital by interacting the region where old believers are concentrated with the presence of old believers. So it pays off if there are lots of old believers around you. To that, I can ask two questions. The first one, why distance is so important? We're not talking about hundreds of miles, right? It's just, 1 kilometer or 10 kilometers. So why an old believer would be less successful in using a network of old believers if he is located west of this concentration area? So that's something that you need to explain. And the other one, the interaction that we have might conceivably be an outcome of agglomeration effect that you mentioned before. It's simply because there are so many textile factories concentrated in this area. That itself can be driven by the presence of old believers. But I think you'll have to explain why this is an effect of social capital among the old believers, rather than being an outcome of the agglomeration effect. And last but not least, I would love to see some explanation as to how networks among old believers matter to their success. One thing that you mentioned is access to finance. Do you have any evidence that we're extending loans to each other in preferential terms, interest-free or whatnot? Do you have anything else? There is a similar story about how ethnic networks, religious networks help in business. And it's described, although in a very sort of aggregate terms, no data, no evidence, in the famous article by James Coleman, Social Capital. And it's about Jewish diamond traders in New York. And in their case, the role of social capital was quite clear, although there was no empirical evidence to support that than saying that they were among the most successful diamond traders. Because when you trade in diamonds, it requires a whole lot of trust. If you want to sell me a diamond, I will have to examine this diamond very carefully. So you simply have to trust me to get this diamond from you, explore it at my leisure, and then get it back to you, or discuss the price. So in that case, trust was a very important driver of the industry. In your case, what is? I'm not quite sure about that. So I think what the story is very plausible, and I think it's very neatly presented. But I would like to see more explanation as to why this is really an outcome of social capital.
So for the second concern, well, unfortunately, the old believers didn't shake hands in some special way, or something that the diamond traders do. And I don't have, like I said, I don't have evidence for this. However, as for the geography, the reason why geography is so important is very simple. Mobility was very small in Russia at that time. So basically, if you look at the list of factory workers, and we have some data on where they were born, they were usually born very close to the factory. People did not move that much. I probably need to include, yeah, it's an important point that needed to explanation.
That sounds fine, but that means that the social capital effect was only in relations between factory owners and workers. If that is the case, that's fine, that explains it. But in this case, you have no story to explain why different owners interact with each other. Because in that case, distance would probably not be such a hugely big deal, right? How long time does it take to cross, on course, the distance between that part and that, probably?
How expensive a horse is.
Given the quality of Russian roads at that time and at the present time, we're still talking about a few hours at most, right? Especially if it's the 19th century, I think at that time there was a good road network.
Okay. Thank you.
Any more questions?
expert on that, and that sounds it's a very interesting topic. First, is there any kinds of restrictions for marriages for all believers and non-normal believers?
Yes, of course.
Because if there were, it was like initial incentives for all believers to form ties to each other, because they know they choose pair for the daughters and sons within the small community, right? And they want to keep business in their extended family, right? So it might be the case how the social capital was maintained, because it's a small community and you need to form new families within the small group. That might be the story to think about. The second question was, since that date on 1881, it's still 20 years after the liberation of Kripostny, right? So in terms of Kripostny, all believers were also presented in those people?
Yes.
Same share?
I don't have the date on this. I don't know.
Because that might be also the source of variation. Because, for example, they might be persecuted not only by, say, government, but also local pomeshchik or someone who was the owner. And in this case, the shares are different for free people and Kripostny, and that might be also source of some explanation, because probably those people who are initially free, they have different labor attitudes from those people who were just liberated 10 years ago. Just a question to think about that.
Okay. The marriages, so yeah, I will answer the two. The marriages is a very hard story, because like I said, there were two cemeteries in Moscow, and one of them had an explicit ban on marriage, which created quite a few problems in terms of having children. Those who had children could not live in the communes. They could live near it. They were not considered to be the true all believers, so they were living something like in a sin. And this commune had because of this commune had a very aggressive missionary process. They went to the regions and they tried to ask people to move to their commune, because this is how the commune could expand. And so they definitely didn't use marriages to form business networks. For the other one, that's the opposite, because we know that Morozovs, the merchants, they used marriages to form business networks. Yeah, there is an evidence of this. They simply married the other merchants, also all believers, to unite the businesses. But the problem is that Morozovs later on converted to Orthodoxy. And we don't know whether they did this because they really stopped being all believers, or because they wanted to pretend to convert.
What other inputs do you need in the textile factory, like rivers or something?
Oh, yeah. So the important things are distance to railroad, distance to river, distance to Moscow, because in Moscow you sell your product quite often. I control for all this. The things that I thought of. But maybe there are some things that I didn't control for, and in this case, I think I should work on this.
Any more questions?
And who are the main consumers for the factory outputs? How's the consumer market?
It was bulk sold in Moscow. And it seems like all believers control that too, but here I don't have, it's hard to find the evidence for this. And then distributed all over Russia. Moscow was an important center for the textile industry at that time. And many historians say that the reason why the all believers specialized in textiles and not, say, in railroad construction or something else is precisely because you could sell it to a wide, after the distribution was for many different people. So you didn't have to do anything with government for this.
And how you measure, and how you measure output?
Total revenue.
Which means that if all believers can negotiate better prices, they have better revenues, right?
So it could be this too, yeah.
Yeah.
Not just all believers, everyone.
No, if they are
yeah, maybe they are better at so it's not supplies, it's not the cost side, it's the...
Yeah.
Do you have any information about about owners of these factories. Are they all believers or not?
Yeah, like I said, no. I tried to. I tried to take the famous ones that were known to be all believers, and I found that they did have factories in the places with many all believers.
Fair enough.
But
the reason I'm asking you that your effect might be simply because all believers are better workers. And again, that explains why factories do so well in the areas where all believers are very highly concentrated. And that, again, probably would not be in agreement with the social capital story. You know, I'm just trying to be a devil's advocate. If indeed you have social capital, then it's important that the owner of the factory and his employees would have special relations, high level of trust, and the owner would be able to save on monitoring costs and whatnot, and that would explain higher productivity. This is also something that I believe might be, and again, your interaction story might be simply an evidence that there is a quadratic relationship between the concentration of all believers and the factory's output or revenue. You know what I mean? So instead of doing interaction, what you can do is to include the square of all believers in your impression, and just, you know, linear small believers, and see what happens. That would be an interesting placebo, something of that sort. So. But if there is any chance to, at least in some cases, form a subsample factories which are owned by all believers, that would be a very interesting thing to see if they are any different from the rest of your factories which are doing well, but those would be doing particularly well. That would be an evidence that there is indeed some social capital effect. Otherwise, it's just, you know, high morale. They drink less, they're more loyal, and they know that it's important to work hard to fulfill promises. That would be a more sort of trigger explanation of what you see than the fancier one that you want to support.
Yeah, but still, the interaction, I mean, the quadratic relationship I tried, it didn't work. Only the linear one works. But still, if I were a devil's advocate myself, yeah, simply the fact that the all believers might be better workers is a story too.
Sober.
So I need, no, sobriety, I thought that I refuted it with drinking houses as a proxy for the drinking. Unfortunately, I don't have the data on the consumption of alcohol at the low level, only at the province level. But yeah, okay.
Do you have any information on health, on education? Because if all believers are more healthy, more educated, this also would develop proxy for their human capital.
Yeah, well, the health I don't have, so I don't know whether they were healthier. We don't have height or any proxy for health, but the human capital, like I said, I have literacy rates in the township where the factory is located, and it seems to have a strong positive effect on the factory's revenue. So places with higher literacy had higher productivity, but it doesn't, still the coefficient for the all believers is there. So, and actually its magnitude even increases when I include the literacy in the regression.
And when you compare the all believers to the rest, in terms of what you have data, how do they differ? If you just summarize that.
Yeah, so what I have is simply for each factory I know how many all believers. Oh, basically another thing is in Moscow at that time there were only two religions, in Moscow region, only two religions. The all believers and the Orthodox. If you're talking about places outside Moscow. Within Moscow we had Protestants, Catholics, Jews and so on. Outside there were like 10 people, literally, of each denomination. So yeah, I have the, so by default all the zero category is the Orthodox, and then if the share of all believers increases, it means that the share of the Orthodox decreases.
I was just wondering how much do they really differ? If they're self-selected to be better from the population group.
Oh, you mean that?
If you just compare them based on the observation.
The self-selection mostly occurred in the 18th century, very early. So doing this, well, I know a person who is doing this for the 12th century about Copts in Egypt, using some old manuscripts, but with the all believers we don't have any, nothing is documented. That would be a hard thing to do. The selection story is hard.
Any more questions or comments?
Yeah, sorry, one more comment to this. They're actually, what the official church did in the beginning of 19th century, they organized something called единоверие. It's when you're an old believer, you can keep your traditions and you can stay you can still cross yourself with 2 fingers rather than 3, but you have to obey the patriarch of the official Russian church. That's the only requirement. And many people converted to this. In my analysis, they are included in the Orthodox population. So I only discuss the true old believers simply because the census did not distinguish between the Orthodox and the people who did this conversion. There are some country-level statistics on how many people converted. The problem is they were created by the official church. And it looks like in some cases the number of converted is higher than the number of the old believers. So I was thinking about doing this, but no.
Well, I think we can thank our speaker.
Thank you.